Hi everybody, welcome back to the leadership track, and our next speaker is Alok Nandi, who is running, let's say, design and experience community across Europe and India, I believe. So please a few words about yourself and introduce your topic to our audience of project managers. So our purpose with this conference, Alok, is to help managers to get the leadership skills in the right way so that they can develop themselves into what we call project leaders. This is a very particular transformation where we go from old school ways of working into the future of work. And I believe on this path there is a strong contribution from product management community, design community, where we could learn from you and give to our audience of doing, let's say, old school project management methodologies to turn it into more customer oriented, interface oriented, experience oriented. Please teach us how we can become more design centric, more capable of helping our customers. This is our ask.
Okay. Thank you, Levent, and hi to everyone. So we'll spend an hour together and we'll explore questions connected to the topic of the day, which is leadership on one side and narrative on the other side. And what I'll try to bring in is a design lens. Before jumping into the presentation, as Levent, you mentioned, I have a number of activities. So I run a design agency, which is called Architempo. And next to that, I have another one, which is called Spread Design. So we are looking into strategic design and AR, VR, brand design, UX, UI. So this is the area. In parallel, I'm a professor in a culinary school, Institut Paul Bocuse, and project, because your core is project. Project in food systems is something we'll spend a few minutes on later. And as a volunteer, I'm busy with two communities. One which is ProjeXplorer night, and that is where Levent we met quite some years ago. Launched ProjeXplorer in Brussels in 2007. And IXDA, which stands for Interaction Design Association. And as I mentioned, I'll bring the design lens. And Interaction Design Association gathers about 120,000 designers on the planet with 200 local chapters. And I'm running, amongst others, the Brussels one. So this gives a very big and rapid view of things which keep me busy, which will allow us to go into what is project for you guys from the PMI community and what could be project for us as designers. Unlearning will be one of the thread, and by unlearning I'll come with a kind of a framework, and that framework will allow us to rethink about design and redesign. Very quickly, I'll use this as a kind of a visual metaphor. We are at the crossroads of many activities. Any project manager, any product manager, any designer, any business, we are often at the crossroads. And my crossroads is, of course, looking at what is desirable, what is viable, and what is feasible. And as project manager, you look at feasibility. As business manager, you look at viability. As designers, we look at desirability. But we need to have the coexistence of these different approaches in order to have successful things happening, successful projects. And of course, I use this from another angle. We need to be people-centric. We need to understand the journey of people, the parcours, and we need to understand the context, the paysage, the landscape. So design is a contextual activity. Project management helps to be sharp into that context. And very briefly, I'm born in Congo and based in Brussels, and I'm coming originally, via my parents, from India. So I try to bring multiple lenses also from a cultural point of view. I've been active in Japan, I've been active in the US and in Europe, of course. And so we have different cultures. And project management without culture doesn't make sense. And the questions we are raising is, especially when we use the design lens, is what if? What if we do this? How might we? And then the third one is why should we? So you see, I'm always positioning all this at the crossroads of some strategic question, some critical question, some ethical question. And this is how I would see the contribution to design activities and design bringing something to project management. Now, at PMI, you are project-centric. One way and very simple, if we have to remember two keywords out of this conversation here, we are projection center. We project ourselves into the future and we try to scope activities. And project is helping to make the projection structured. And that is where it's sometimes tricky. It might be full of tension. It might be full of friction because some of us have different understanding of what the project is and how it should run. And so through this presentation, I'm trying to look at the tension between projection and project. And for this, I come back always with the notion of experimentation. When, as a project manager, you are running your project, normally you are not into experimentation. But we as designers, we are experimenting. And I'm putting experimentation versus expectation. And expectation is a heavy word. And of course, any project manager has to manage the expectation of, I would say, a quite number of stakeholders, be it internal, be it with the customer, be it external, and so forth. And to make the connection between experimentation, which is design-led, and expectation, which is stakeholder-led or market-led, we are looking at experiences. We are trying to see how and what people go through. And these three notions are interrelated. And sometimes they are quite difficult to work on because experience is the outcome. And before that, the output. And I'm sure Levent will have some conversation on that. So I'll be quite abstract because I think as a project manager, as a designer, as a leader, you need to zoom in, zoom out, and try to understand what is at stake. And so that's why I'm coming with this notion. Before continuing, I like this quote. I'll share three quotes. One by Muriel Rukeyser, a philosopher, and she said some 60 years ago, the universe is made of stories, not atoms. And this is quite inspiring because we as human beings, we are storytelling animals. We are narrative animals. We are sharing knowledge through that. And if you look at the happening of a project, you'll see that the project has a point A and hopefully a point B. A project specifically ends at a certain moment. But what makes the project a project and what glues the different phases are stories. And stories lead to experiences. So this is, I would argue, inspiration number one. Inspiration number two, and I mentioned I'm professor in a culinary and hospitality school. Cooking is a language through which society unconsciously reveals its structure. Now, what is interesting about this is the emerging structure. Be it a project manager, be it a business manager, be it a designer, be it an entrepreneur, we are trying to understand context and try to identify patterns and try to look into what is emerging and how we can build out of that. So I'll play with structure and infrastructure later in my talk. And the third quote is by science fiction writer Gibson, where he mentioned the future is already here. It's just not very evenly distributed yet. And I guess that the last 2 years we are going through allows us to think about the notion of distribution, allows us to think about resilience, allows us to say, how can we be inspired by what is happening in some other geographies and try to implement that, but taking into account the context. So keep these three quotes in mind because they are helping us to make sense. And making sense is one of the most complex activity we are busy with. And I'm back to this kind of multiple lenses approach. And I'll share with you 7 keywords. The first one is stage. How are we setting the stage for things to happen? A project manager has a specific way to set the stage. A designer would be explorative stage, while a project manager will be hopefully convergent. The stage is part of what I call the landscape, escape. And I was mentioning the notion of contextuality. You're running your activity, your project, your entrepreneurial venture in a specific scape. And that play field is the thing you'll need to understand. Otherwise, you might end up in non-appropriate activity. And you'll see that many project managers are fighting against some contextual element, and I'm sure we'll come back on that. The third one is scale. So we have talked about stage, we have talked about scape, and now scale. And scale is one of the most complex notion. And a small project can be mastered by one project manager. A big project needs multiple project managers, and there comes often the tension between some of the team members of the project because of communication issues, because of cultural issues, because of assumptions. So if I go to the next one is scope. Scope is an activity which is done by multiple stakeholders. It might begin by the leadership. Remember, we are in the leadership track. And a good leader allows to help people scope. They don't do the scoping. They are making sure that the landscape allows the scope to have things in the right dimensions. Now, if you put scope versus scale, you see that these two notions are in resonance. And this allows to move to the next shaping. How do we shape organizations? How do we shape projects? How do we shape services? How do we shape experiences? So you see that I have begun with the scape approach, the context, and I'm moving towards the shape. And the shape allows me also to come with this notion, which is, again, a complex one, the speed. The speed of doing stuff. Do we give time to time? Do we put pressure? And all these notions allows us to look into what makes what I would argue the magical source of a designer, of a project manager. And that is based on experience, that is based on peer learning, that is based on the interactions we'll have between the PMI community and the design community. And we look into stage in different ways. My focus on stage is what is happening now and here. Experiential. This notion of now and here is very fundamental and allows us to give the specificity on looking at the notion of stage. We're looking at people interacting in places. And in order to do that, we need to make sure that we understand physical abilities, we understand cognitive abilities, and we understand social abilities. And that is where it becomes tricky. Levent, you were mentioning the old school way of project management. And I guess the old school was looking essentially at physical a lot and partly social. And here comes cognitive. Why? Because we have AI, machine learning, computational design, and we need to put that into resonance for sound project management, especially when you have a big scale. So that is one challenge. The tension between people and places is what will keep us busy. We are designing things. We are designing things for people. We are doing the design of things, services and products. We are designing stuff enabled by others. And so the word design is very loaded. I'm sure in Bulgaria you have some notions of what is design, what design could be. In France and Belgium, the Francophone language tends often to confuse design with decoration. And here we are in English. Design is about conceiving and shaping and making stuff. And I'll come back to that. Yeah.
Sander, so when you say design, I always think form and function.
Absolutely. But I'll add another one. Maybe you might have seen on my website. Designing is about making the interactions between form, function, and fiction.
Yes. The narrative.
Form and function. Yeah, narrative.
What
Form
Foucault,
and function is a bipolar way of looking at systems,
I
which
think
is very 20th century.
I think design has, we have to talk about industrial design and maybe more postmodern design, in the sense that since Foucault, we are also talking about discourse as a part of the process. If you look at a product like Google, you know, the material design, for example, it's kind of a discourse to keep things simple so that it will be a universal low barrier where things wouldn't get too hard for everyone. So it's kind of an ideological choice. If you ask me, Google is actually applying a certain ideology, let's call it material design, but actually this is like there's a game, there's an economy, there's a system, and all these in AI we have the same discussion. Who's going to lead AI? Because we are in a leadership track, I think we shouldn't forget that in technology, politics is too late. When politics is involved, we have seen with Facebook, you know, Zuckerberg goes to the Supreme Court and has to answer some silly questions like, what's going on here? People don't even understand what tracking is, and they make assumptions, but actually politicians are very late. But the real discourse, I think, is closer to theory, because you mentioned French way of looking at design. Is very different than the Bulgarian one, because here the dominant narrative comes from tradition, while in France it comes from logic.
Yeah, right. And you are mentioning Google with their material design, which comes into resonance with the slide we are having now here, which is scaled. And scale as a notion is very complex, and you're mentioning of Facebook, of Google, and some others, is raising the notion of how do you design when you're designing for 1 billion plus people, and the touch point is a device which is in your pocket.
But even scale evolves, because Twitter used to be limited to 140 because of another SMS limitation, scale, let's say. But now it has to evolve, right? So scale is also something that evolves.
And that brings complexity.
Yep.
And often we are too late in the game, and that is the challenge. So the way I look into this, and it will come in resonance with what you mentioned, narrative is at the crossroads of. Often we talk about time and space, but I put into resonance also of tempo and place. What do I mean by that? Time is something which is so-called physical, the arrow of time. Space is something our body is inscribed in. But place is, and I would argue there, place is about space with memory. You're talking of Bulgaria and some tradition, because there is memory of things which happen at certain time. And that is where storytelling becomes an interesting tool for leaders, because they need to understand place and they need to give the tempo. It's like when you are having a musical band. A tempo allows to enjoy the music with specific rhythm, and that allows you to enjoy. And for me, leadership is about the ability to articulate the understanding of place and the pushing of tempo. And that is where narrative plays a role. And
also plays another role, if you ask me, of iterations. Because if you're in a repeated game, or the dynamic of how you approach design and how it gets accepted, how it gets modified, over time it becomes more like a relationship, right? And that relationship has to have some kind of negotiation, some kind of bargaining, even a political game, you know. It's a bit like, it becomes like a chess game. So the iteration, the tempo is not just, let's say, one person who's talking, but it's also what happened last game. Did I win? And this game, this second round, how can I get back at my... So it becomes almost like a game as well, right?
yeah, and I can apply that to project management.
Yes.
With a specific example.
Yes.
When we have 2 or 3 creative people working together in the world of architecture, we see that they are getting into sync. We talk about the notion of co-synchronicity if they feel that they're doing the right stuff. And that is something fascinating about tempo. We as human beings, we get into sync in collaborative works if we feel good about that. And that is something I explore in some of the workshops that I'm busy with. So what I'm sharing here is a kind of framework which I apply and work on with workshop participants. Because one of the paradox is the following. We are spending an hour together. We are looking at multiple notions. We are trying to make sense. But the best way to make sense is to work on some specific projects together in workshops and then reflect, the reflective practitioner position. And it allows to think about 2 approaches. What is the frame and how are we reframing? Levens, you mentioned about iteration. Iteration is about thinking about reframing. And what is the structure? And how can we make sure that the structure is appropriate? And in order to make that, we need to understand the infrastructure. So we see that these are interconnected notions. Any project manager is busy with that. Any designer is busy with that. But we are looking at that from a different angle. Any entrepreneur
there is even more to this, because you can have a frame and a structure within one project. But what if you have a program? Like you said, the project repeats, then it's a program over time, over space, over players and the roles, but actually it's the same thing that repeats again and again, or it has a coherent structure. So the relationship between the projects, the relationship between one project and the program itself, right? So these are all interrelations because it's probably using the same resources. There has to be some decision on attributing them to different, fixing them basically is the choice. So there's a choice, there's a decision, but then there's also the connection to strategy where the entire portfolio of decisions that are made could create very complex and zero-sum relations between structure. Like today, for example, we have to fix the roads. Tomorrow we have to fix the bridges. Tomorrow we have to build some tunnels. So I think this kind of choices are also, in a way, disruptive to a natural organic process where we seem to be all pushing resources in one direction and another one. The reframing actually could be very disruptive, right?
Could be, yeah. Now, what you're alluding to also is about systems thinking.
Yeah.
If we use reframe and infrastructure, and the examples you gave, it's a lot about systems thinking. And systems thinking allows us to think about the future. If we are running a project, it's not to remain in the place where we were. We are trying to shape the future. And that is where I see an interesting interrelationships between project management and design. The notion of future brings us back to the landscape, the scape, or the playfield. If you have a playfield, you need of a playbook. And the playbook is an output which is done in dialogue between project managers, designers, and leaders. And often I like to use also this quote, which in Western centric world we tend to forget. This is coming from Latin America. The notion of senti pensar, combination of feeling and thinking. And that is something we see a lot in Latin America. And that is influencing project management. That is influencing the design lens. How can we embed that and not be frustrated because we didn't talk about this notion of senti pensar, feeling and thinking?
We have a few, let's say, pure project management topics speakers in our program. One of them is Mike Burrows, and he talks about doing this wholeheartedly. You know, adapt an organization, a project, managing itself and becoming and evolving, but doing it wholeheartedly means that there is actually balance in the decisions, but also there is probably, I think this is one of the most difficult things to understand about leadership, is not just talking and making decisions, but actually creating a culture or an identity. In one of our community meetings, our host Sensata, we talked about culture and culture of innovation. And I congratulated them because culture is one of the most difficult products, most difficult designs. It's so complex. It involves so many different minds, let's say socializing and coming up with something that wasn't there before. You know, you cannot design culture, right? It's kind of emergent phenomena. It emerges after you look at culture, after it happens. You cannot design it before. This is where I want to also ask you some examples where, as an experienced designer, how much influence you have over the outcome of such experiments where you can say, okay, I think the result will be such, and then we will have a cultural outcome, an intangible. Then you can go about measuring this. How can you measure an experience? How can you design it, execute it, and afterwards measure the impact?
So it's interesting that you are coming with the focus on the notion of culture, because my next slide is about monoculture. Yeah. And the challenge I see on the planet is that we are brainwashed by the culture of money. And this is a fascinating book which is looking at capitalism and monoculture, which is driving many activities. And if we talk about senti pensar, and Levent, you mentioned that culture cannot be designed, I can be even more brutal, and I can say that experience design is a bizarre term, because you cannot design experience. You design conditions for experience to happen. And then the emergence and the aggregation and the accumulation of multiple experience gives you culture. And this is an interesting take, which is, you ask for examples. We have many activities which are connected to emerging cultures in social systems. And we have learned that when we don't have diversity in systems, the system becomes weak, fragile. And culture needs diversity and needs multiple languages. And so that's why I have put this quote. I'm sure people won't have time to go through that. And that's why I have put in red the ability to express ourselves out of the economic realm. And your conference is focused on the project economy. My provocation to all of us is, how can we create project ecology? By having project ecology as a lens, which is a design lens, we can have project economy as one thread amongst the ecology. And that gives us the ability to think about the interrelationships between creativity, the creative project manager, in the economic market.
On
But the
this
economic
slide,
market, yeah.
sorry, I thought you were finished. The creativity part, I think there is also a bit of a risk that once you enter this, let's say, we have a session about personal branding. Imagine that your creativity and the way you enter the economic market is like today. I'm coming here, I'm hosting, you are coming as a speaker, we have a role. Actually, we are also a design because the expectations from what we have to do, what we have to say, how we are supposed to be a leader, how we are supposed to work, in a way, the designers are also in a position where they are the subject of another discourse, another narrative, where we think that we have to play a certain role as a designer. And you could be, maybe when you were born, you were not 100% of a designer, right? You had to learn all those skills. So let's say if the designer, from a professional point of view, they are also a product. You know, you have to learn these things, you have to be shaped, you have to be mentored, you have to respect some rules. So in a way, the worker, the project manager, is also a design as a career, right?
Yeah. Now, we could spend hours thinking about the interrelationships between design and designer.
Yep.
Everybody does design activities at different scales. A designer positions herself or himself as someone who is focusing in a structured manner and making sure that creative skills with critical skills are allowing to think about the future, things which yet don't exist. So for me, design is about working on things which yet don't exist. Now, you might counter argue that entrepreneurs are doing the same. Yes, because many entrepreneurs are designers.
Yes.
And so I would like all of us, be it in your community of PMI, be it in our design communities, to forget the romantic image of design. Design is not about designing yet another chair. Design has multiple skills. We are designing services, we are designing objects, we are designing places, architectural design. We are designing meta places like urban design and so forth. And so design is a very loaded word. And design has to struggle.
What I wanted to say is that I wanted to warn, because you mentioned provocation, but actually we should warn ourselves in trying to act like a leader. We may have to be very authentic, because if we are following a certain design or a prototype or a shape or a form that is expected of us in the creativity and the market, we may start playing a role and in a way at some point stop being ourselves, right? And instead of looking for the real creation, something new that wasn't there before, we may just start repeating ourselves like a musician. You know, imagine that you are a musician. There's a very big difference between a composer who creates pure music, let's say, and somebody who actually performs it. Maybe this is also a very interesting thing. Notion is somebody who wants to develop themselves. Why do they do that? Because you are put in a performer position, but you want to become a creator. How do you go from performer to creator, inventor? I think this is where probably we see the light of the brightness of, let's say, a leader. This can be a very simple guidance you give to somebody, mentoring. It can be speaking at an event and sharing your knowledge. But actually there is no, let's say, predefined way of becoming a leader. It could be in so many different ways, as long as you can contribute to somebody else's development, let's say.
Now, if I try to build on that one, how do we position project manager versus project designer is a question that you might explore in some of your meetups at PMI.
So in between the manager and the leader, there is a designer, because this is how you will find your speech. This is how you will develop your narrative before you go on to leadership, because you need to try to create, let's say, not just making decisions, which are obviously most of the time, let's say, ambivalent. You know, you could go left or right, and a lot of times we make the decision, then we find out that actually we made the wrong one. It's just a choice, binary.
Yeah.
But if you look at it as a personal development objective and say, I am in a performance, develop myself and go to the next level, I don't think you can do that without going through some designer role. This is the path that you are giving us now. Think about designing projects. How can you create projects before you can actually start leading them? I'm afraid a lot of us, we are pushed to a leading role just because of seniority, or there is nobody else to do it. We are required to take the lead, because the previous leader left. We are just occupying that space without necessarily having neither the tempo nor the structure for it.
Yeah, and so that allows me to bring to you on screen that African proverb. Until the lions have their own historians, the history of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. Now replace the lions by the project managers. How will you read this sentence? And that is where it becomes interesting. Because some leaders tend to undervalue project managers. Because leaders can take the lead in sharing their narratives. But I would argue that project managers need also to come with some narrative, to explain the complexity of the process, to explain the journey. And that is where I see the role of narrative, helping people to grow, to share knowledge. And that leads us to the notion of shape that I was mentioning in my framework. And shape is about narratives of design and design of narratives. And it allows us to think, and you can look into any project, there is causality. Something happened led to something next. How does a good project manager understand causality is fundamental. I don't know if you have that in some of your other panels or talks, but causality is something you could spend ages on. And to causality, you have this notion of choosing, which is fundamental. A good project manager has the capacity to choose the right stuff to do in the very near future. A designer allows to choose for a longer horizon. And so we are playing with time scale there. But both project management and design requires us to think about choosing. Now, an entrepreneur or a leader.
One of the first steps, actually, I'm going to link here the question that we have from the audience. When you set the frame, what about the boundaries? I think in a lot of projects, in the beginning, there is some design work for designing the project, initiation phase. How we are going to work, we call this the way of working. So, but causality, I have studied causality for like 15 years in my academic work and later in business. First company I created was called Because. Because. Yeah, I mean, it's very important that we are able to interact and manipulate our environment. This is, I think, what we call a project is a very linear and easy to understand form. The project concept in itself has an inherent attribute, value, that it has to be very simple and very structured for everyone to understand the work that is happening. And we have what we call a project management methodology is actually defining how the causalities between players and stakeholders and the roles and responsibilities follow a certain template, so that in repeated games, in repeated projects, over time, we would avoid similar mistakes. But before we even go to individuality or understanding what's happening or manipulating it, I think going back to what you said, previous slides, the question says, what about the boundaries? Can we not extend the boundaries if we are good at managing the causality?
So that comes into resonance with the notion of scope. Good scoping allows to have good project management happening.
Yep.
And scoping is about positioning boundaries. And scoping is useful and strong if there is what I call critical need. You need to be critic versus the system and make sure that the boundaries you are setting are meaningful. And so it allows us then to move into prototyping. Because the person who was asking about boundaries might not know in her head what could be the ideal boundaries. And there comes the notion of prototyping in order to set the right scoping, the right boundaries. So it's learning by doing. And that is where we need to educate our juniors, our leaders need to play a role by telling, stop talking, start doing. Stop talking that you will do, start doing a prototype. And that is going to bring to project management much more value. And for me, prototyping is the mindset of design, that we need to see more into classical project management. Now, in a previous life, I was working for Procter & Gamble. Big company, big projects, big blah, blah, blah. I'm sure maybe you have some P&G people there. And what I was missing was this notion of prototyping. And that is something that I would urge all these communities to keep in mind. Stop talking, start doing. That will be through prototyping. And so that brings us to scope, which was mentioned earlier by the question referring about.
Here I have a question about the process. Imagine that we are going to launch a project, and like you said, we need to do a bit of experiment. Why? Because we don't exactly know what the new project will be like. We don't exactly know everything that we will do. I think this is where the Agile movement started, by not forcing, restraining yourself not to try to predict the future, not to predict the causality, and let it just be ready for what comes so that you can achieve better performance and flow by not defining all those interactions. In that sense, what is your comment on, let's say, agile design?
So it's very interesting that you come with that, because you see on my slide, I came up with two words, navigation and interaction. Mm-hmm. And agile is a way to navigate into systems. Sometimes agile is overhyped, but that's why I take some critical distance. And I try to understand what could agile mean. Agile could mean good understanding of the context, finding the right tempo, and navigate. So the metaphor of navigation is fundamental, because it allows to be careful about not being too focused on causality, but navigate into complex systems and interact with people. So we are back to choosing, and we are back to enabling. A good leader enables project manager to choose. And that is where I see intention. A good designer allows to make sure that people can choose and people are empowered. So leadership and design are in resonance with another notion that we talked very little here, which is entrepreneurship. We put entrepreneurship with leadership, with designership. We have these common attributes. And it's about enabling and choosing. And it allows, I'll skip this for the sake of time, it allows me to bring into what I call the magical sauce. And the magical sauce, of course, some of you might know this person. He was a 3-star Michelin chef in France, Paul Bocuse, and he was doing sauce. So I use that as an attribute. And another inspiration is Tintin, the comic book, because I'm based here in Brussels. And I use this, and I'm sure Levent will comment on that. Design begins always with a narrative. and gets concrete through interactions, artifacts, environments, infrastructures, experiences, and stories.
I
So
think
this allows
I think this will allow what you have written there is quite a good reading of the entire, let's say, takeaway. I will invite all our attendees. I think we have 400 of them, even more than 400, to think a little bit how good you are according to Alok's definitions that you saw today. You may not have realized that you were a designer. You may not have realized that you actually do this without thinking. This happens every day. We cannot just say there is a plan and we stick to the plan and execute the tasks, distribute the thing, without realizing that you are actually facing design choices. Now, the interactions, artifacts, environments, infrastructures, experiences, stories. Please think about all those things that you do every day as a project manager, and try to see retell your story. I think narrative is a very good word because you don't need to change anything. You can become a better leader not by doing something different or crazy or heroic. You can just change your story of how you explain what you're doing. And Alok, here, one of the things that I love to do is ask everyone, take a mirror, you know? If you're going to tell a story, look at the mirror and see how that story changes you. Because if you, I know a lot of people, they look at the mirror and say, bad mirror, you know? They say, oh, this mirror, I hate mirrors. But it's not the mirror that is the problem, it's always us. And it's not even us, but what we think of ourselves. Maybe we also have this psychiatric process of also thinking about introspection, you know, how do you introspect, how do you retrospect, how do you also share the same information with the others. If I go to everyone and I say I'm a bad person or I made bad choices, you see, in a way I'm using the narrative against me, and maybe I'm just seeking attention for others to tell me, actually you are not so bad, you are better than this and better than that. We also go in this storytelling mode where it's not anymore the design, but our ego enters into the design. What do you say when I read this? What would you say to a project manager who's looking at the mirror and has to think of a better design and not better ego, let's say?
I'll use your metaphor of the mirror, and I'll say any project manager should be a good reflective practitioner. Reflective,
Reflection, yes.
reflection of the mirror, but reflective, taking distance and perspective. And the metaphor you're using now with the project manager and the mirror, I slightly displace that and I use this notion of reflective practitioner as a fundamental attribute for any project manager to be a performing project manager, both performing and performant. That would be my take on this metaphor. And that allows me to think about, I'll skip this, two notions, and I'm sure we'll be running out of time. In narrative, we talk a lot about suspension of disbelief. People are in a story because they agree to be in the story. They suspend their disbelief and they are part of the journey. A good project manager will take anyone, leadership, stakeholder, in their journey because they are strong into that. And the second one is point of view. The point of view is fundamental to make sure that the project is not run in a linear way, but with a point of view which gives a directional way. And directional can change because of context, because of boundaries, because of capabilities, because of capacity. But a good project manager has a point of view. And this point of view allows to have some ethical stance, some behavioral stance, some empathy, and so forth. And so this gives us speed, sense-making and change-making, immersion and engagement. These are all notions we could expand but I'm sure that I'm just checking the time.
I think we
left.
can slowly wrap up, and if there are no more questions, somebody is asking about the responsibility, our responsibility as designers. I think this is quite straightforward to answer. It's obviously everywhere, right? Everything that we do is responsible. We are responsible for everything.
And I would like to stress one point, which is responsibility lies also with leaders.
Of the users, not the designer.
Yeah, both. So responsibility is a distributed notion, which is a complex one. And there comes two keywords I would like to focus on. Prediction. Prediction is based on the past. Anticipation is what project managers and designers are busy with. We can anticipate because we have accumulated knowledge, and we can take into account things which could happen. Prediction is good for machine learning. We accumulate knowledge about the past and we extract patterns. And what happens if an assumption is not known by the machine learning system? We'll have a crash. And so a good project manager is not only predictive, it's also anticipative. And that is one of the added value of design and designerly approaches into project management.
Thank you, Alok.
And we can go on automation.
I think you probably have. Do you have more slides?
I'm wrapping up with this slide. You
Perfect.
see, where I put all the notions like stage, speed, shape, scope, scale, and scape together, and that is where the magic sauce is happening. The interactions between all these notions. With an approach focused on action, the ability to abstract, the ability to understand the transaction, and the ability to master the interactions. And if I put abstraction, interaction, and transaction at the crossroads, we have this. So the components of this magic sauce is the ability to combine abstraction, transaction, and interaction, and to master and to be active with the other dimensions, which are.
But where is the surprising ingredient in the sauce? I think for an authentic sauce, we always also need a bit of imagination or creativity to add something that others, because a design, I'm not sure if you're talking about industrial design where it's okay to be, let's say, just another design, or are you talking about an original design where I guess we would also have to use the context, the scope of the project and what is required to come up with a unique design, because it's like you say prototype, but it's not always the same thing. I think the danger is to treat every project the same way, while maybe in some projects, most of them 80% the same, 20% is different, but maybe in others it's 20% like the others and 80% completely unique project, right?
And that is where the source plays a role, you see, because you understand the landscape. You understand how to play with the shape at the right scale. So a mature project manager will be the one who keeps the tempo. The notion of tempo is in what I call the magic sauce. And that is something that you learn by doing. We have a very simple saying. The proof is in the pudding. A good experience is something you don't talk about. You remember bad experiences and you express that. But good experiences tend to become invisible. And that is the paradox we are busy with as designers. If everything runs well in a project management process, leadership won't be frustrated, client will be happy, and the magic sauce will go smoothly. But if there are tensions and friction, that is where people will scream and will be frustrated. So our job as designers and your job as a project manager, inspirer, is to make people understand that in order to have things running smoothly, they need to have a systems view. And what I tried through this intervention is say systems is too big and too generic. How do we structure that by looking at the stage, at the scale, and the dimensions which are scale and scope, and speed and shape. And if you look at the upper part of the system, scale, scape, and scope, they are more helicopter view. They are more intangible. And if you look at the lower part, speed, shape, and stage, they are more experiential. We learn by doing. And that is where we have an interesting tension, which makes us less abstract. We need to master abstraction, but we need to be concrete.
About the interaction, oh, sorry. Just the
we are back
interaction
to the
part.
three questions.
Question is designer a lonely person? Is it one mind? Or are there also interactions between the conceptually, are there also interactions between how you would do this, how I would do this, and if you start talking to each other, it will be a hybrid? Or maybe one of the things why project managers rarely think about design is because we distribute the team roles. So everybody contributes to the design in a different way. So at the end, there is not just a full designer who designs everything, but everybody is, let's say, 10% of a designer, you know? So actually the team, it's again, it's not one person's job. That's why maybe there is no such thing as project designer, because it is given, it is defined. There is more definitions than designs. You see what I mean?
Now, we can spend an hour on that, because for me, design is about the expression of intention. And project management is about mastering the expression of intention and make the project reality. Now, this might sound philosophical, but it is not. And interaction designers are never alone. Designers don't work for themselves. Otherwise, they are artists.
Actually, the standard project management, standard PMI projects, let's say, they start with a project charter. And that charter is actually a design document in the sense that it documents the intentions.
Absolutely, the specifications.
Yep.
Yeah. And so you see that we are able to interconnect all these notions and come back to what if, how might we, why should we? And these were the three questions. And this allows me to finish this presentation and say that this notion of project, I try to articulate that versus projection as our ability to look into what doesn't exist yet. Because remember, project managers are busy shaping things which are in the becoming. That is where we need to master that magic sense. So I hope, Levent, we have been through.
Yes, but you know, this is a very namaste. It's a very abstract journey, and I think people probably need some time to. Would you? Are you on Huva, or can you send us some resources? Because you must have pulled some of this some ideas from resources, or can we direct people just to your website so that they can really take some time to digest what you have shown us?
Yeah, so I have a website where I'm busy crafting number of these questions, and it is called narrative.in. HTTPS narrative.in.
Okay, I will share this with people. We thank you so much. Unfortunately, we have to close now.
Yeah.
And as usual,
you can find the links on my website.
Are you using Huva? Can you update your profile there?
Yeah, I have installed Huva, so I can add that.
Perfect. I love what you have shown us, and I feel more relaxed when the abstract is distilled. You know, that it actually makes sense and it explains what we every day do and we don't think about. This is so. Thank you for this awakening.
We should plan a workshop in the near future.
Yes, why not?
Because that will allow us to learning by doing.
Perfect. I will organize something. I'll call you afterwards. Thank you so much being our guest.
Thank you, Levent, and hi to everyone there. Enjoy.
And take care with some good traditional tea and chai and.
Yeah, you might have heard that my voice is a little bit cuckoo. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Bye.
Have a great day. Bye. Enjoy.